As we entered the 20th century, most American families lived on small farms. Small farms very much like the one behind us here, or in the rural communities that surrounded those farms. They lived at a time when taking care of oneself, one's self-reliance, was almost a daily part of life. From a small flock of chickens with the eggs that they supplied and the extra meat, and even the corn with which they're fed from a field in back of the farmhouse here, to a root cellar, a smokehouse, a small herd of cattle, a couple of horses for plowing and working the ground. All of these things and the technologies that made it possible to capitalize on their production were a part of American life. We've lost that connection with our past, and we can probably never completely recapture it. But there are aspects of that technology, of the skills that were known by our parents and our grandparents, which can be important to us today. Let's take a walk back into the past. One of the most important structures in that early American farm was the root cellar, such as the one we're standing in now, underground, covered by sod. Some of my fondest personal memories go back to a boyhood on a Vermont farm, and time spent in a root cellar, much like this one, admiring the Green Mountain potatoes, the Wolf River apples, the hanging wedges of cheese which we'd made ourselves, and all the produce of our fall garden, kept there throughout the long winter and into the warm spring months in an environment that was just perfect for food preservation. And now we're going to move on to another structure which was very important in that early American farm. In the days before refrigeration, this smokehouse was a very important part of the American self-sufficiency system. And my own memories are rich with the smell of wood smoke created by burning apple chips and corn cobs. This is the place where family hams and bacon came from to take us through the long winter months. We live in a world today that is very different from the world we have been visiting here. In fact, change itself may be the greatest challenge that we face. My own father was born into a world in which the fastest thing outside of a good horse was a steam locomotive at 100 miles per hour. And yet by the time he died, mankind was circling the Earth at 14,000 miles per hour in a man-made space vehicle. And yet for 8,000 years up until that time, very little had changed. The fact is that today, very few Americans live in this kind of an idyllic homestead situation. Most Americans live within cities and in the rural areas that abound around them. And today only 3% of us spend our time raising the food and producing the clothing for the rest of us. And in this interim, we have lost touch with a valuable part of our past. We think it may be important to relearn some of the skills and technologies that make it easier for us to contend with the kinds of emergencies that can arise in our own lives today. Because after all, this earth is no easier a place to live in and no freer of emergencies today than it ever was. We have virtually no control over the factors that confront us with such challenges. Most of the time, we do not have the ability to stop those things from happening. But there are things we can do, steps we can take to fortify our family with the ability to deal with them better. We can start by making our homes into resource centers. We can prepare our family to deal with these emergencies by planning in advance. We can become less dependent upon the supermarket and the outside world for helping us resolve problems. We can take steps to strengthen our homes, and we can do it by starting today and taking one step at a time. One of my most frequently asked questions is, where do I start? Where can I spend my family's hard-earned money to make the greatest difference in making us more danger-proof, more emergency-resistant? My answer to that question is in the area of food, because of all of the things that Americans invest their money in, perhaps nothing in the long run returns more than the food that we eat every day. I know of no period in the last several decades when food items have not been worth more at the end of a measuring period than they were at the beginning. Therefore, buying more than we need, having a plan whereby where acquiring a thoughtful surplus of the things that our family will be using every day is the easiest way to begin to become more self-reliant in the home. For most of us, there needs to be a starting point for a new project. We need to examine where we are and where we're going, and that implies setting some goals. We need to start out by deciding that we can commit a certain amount of our budget to this plan of making our family more self-reliant. And then we need to ask some questions. What should we store? What are the things that we use on a regular basis? Where in our home can we store them? What are the logical places for setting these things aside? How long will they last? What's their shelf life? How long are they going to be nutritiously good for us? And where do we begin? What are some of the technologies we need to acquire to become better at this thing we call family preparedness? In its simplest form, family food storage is nothing more than buying more than we need and doing it consistently and as part of a plan. It means every time we use up a can of fruit cocktail that we go to the store and replace it with 2. Economically, it makes good sense and it's highly doable. It doesn't exhaust our spendable income in order to do that. It's important to remember, too, that animal protein is going to be one of the most difficult things to replace in times of need. Therefore, our supply should take into consideration things such as tuna fish and salmon and other canned meat products. If you have a freezer, by all means, fill the freezer. It's more economical to operate a freezer that's full than one that's half empty to begin with. And then we must be conscientious and consistent about doing it. This is a plan. It's not something that we do just by happenstance. That implies that other members of the family understand the importance of this plan. And I would caution you about getting caught up in some of these quick fix plans that are around that propose to give us a year's supply of food in sealed containers containing some kind of food that we've never heard of before in a form that our family has never tried before. It's ridiculous to think that our children are suddenly going to like something in an emergency that they don't presently like. So keep in mind the palate and the perks of your own family as you put your supply aside. Put aside things that they like. Use them regularly. It's important that your supply be something that you use. We're not building a statue. We're not making a bronze piece of art in our basement. What we're doing is building a living supply of things that we use. So use the things that you buy and buy the things that you use. An important part of any food storage program is some kind of a dating system, a mechanism for permitting us to know the age of the products that are on our shelf. A simple way to do this is to have a date stamp and an ink pad and some of these strippable labels nearby, so that whenever we're adding a piece of canned goods, some packaged goods, or some home preserved foods to our supply, we simply put a date on it. As important as the dating in our rotation system is some kind of an inventory system, a plan that will help us to realize where we are with respect to our goals. This can be accomplished by using a sheet, and you might follow the design that is suggested in the booklet accompanying this video, in which we label the foods that we have, the goals that we've established for them, and then in increments to keep records of those that are taken from the shelves and those that are added to it. Now there's a problem, as you might already have thought about, in this program that's built around commercial commodities. Canned goods by their very nature are heavy, bulky, occupy a lot of space. Packaged goods, processed foods are similarly hard to store in large enough quantities to make a difference, and they're relatively expensive. The best answer then, and the very heart of a food storage program, is to get back to basics. If we're not presently working with basic foods, it means changing our technology a little bit, learning how to work more with the basic food elements, the components of all of those things that are important to us if we're going to live well for a period of time. And that's what we're going to talk about next, getting back to basics. The typical American consumes over 200 pounds of animal protein in the course of an average year in the form of fresh meat, fresh fish. Now that's about 75 times as much as the average Asian gets to eat in the same period of time. In short, Americans consume more protein than they need, probably up to 12% more than we can actually use in our systems. If we were attempting to prepare for one of those we hope we never have happen scenarios, we would have to build a family storage program around commodities that have a long shelf life and yet can compensate for the protein we would be losing ordinarily in a meat diet. It's no accident that down through the years, man has used as a symbol of life and wealth that of the grain, an image of wheat, barley, the other grains that have been with us since biblical times and before. And so as we approach this subject of getting back to basics, of dealing with fundamentals, we begin with two important food families. The grain family, which for most Americans takes the form of wheat more often than not, and the legume family, made up of peas and beans. The reason that these two commodities are so essential to us is that they have an extremely long shelf life. Some will tell you even an unlimited shelf life. Not too long ago, in the excavations of some tombs and ancient pyramids, the archaeologists brought forth wheat grains that dated back over 2,000, maybe as much as 4,000 years. Not only were they still nutritionally viable, but when planted, they germinated. The life that was locked within the recesses of that seed were still alive. And so as we begin to contemplate those things that will last for a long period of time and yet give us a wide variety of foods that we can make ourselves at home in our kitchens, we'll begin with the family of grains. For most Americans, when we speak of grain, we automatically think of wheat, because that has become just about the grain of our country. The white flours that we buy in the markets and use in our commodities are, of course, whole wheat. They were whole wheat, that is, before they were processed. As we begin to work with a home supply of grain, it becomes possible for us to use unprocessed, that is, unrefined grains. And so being able to convert whole grains into things like this, the breads that we eat at every meal of the day, cereal products that we have for breakfast and at other times, and even pasta. These are all things that we can make ourselves at home from our own basic supplies. Nothing is more economical than starting out with fundamental foods. The grains and legumes that we store in our basements or underneath our pantry shelves are commodities that will be with us and will be in good shape even after they've been subjected to long periods of storage. I'm presently working with whole wheat right here that I placed in my supplies over 25 years ago. Because it was a high quality wheat to begin with, and because its moisture content was low, then the viability of that grain today is virtually unchanged from the time I put it into my supplies. Shelf life is one of the most important things. It's almost an article of faith in this area of food storage. And if we're really planning for the future, if we're looking even beyond that 1 year supply, it becomes most important then that we think in terms of such foods as these. Wheat lends itself to the American palate. We're accustomed to it. We've eaten it for so long and in so many forms that we don't have to make much of an adaptation to be able to accept it. Working with whole grains widens the nutrition parameters for us within grains. And aside from wheat, we can vary our grain supply by going to such things as rye and oats, which are one of the best muscle-building foods around us, and very, very high in fiber, which we've recently become accustomed to. Barley is one of the ancient grains that's spoken of even in biblical times, and that can be important to us not only in the form of flour, but because it adds so much nutrition to soups and stews. Rice, of course, is a grain upon which more people live than any other grain in the world. And rice is no less important to us in the kind of diet we're talking about now than any of these other grains. Corn is an interesting grain for Americans. When the very first Europeans came to this land, they discovered that the Indians were growing a grain which was very unusual to them. In fact, corn was called maize, and it came to be known as corn only because in biblical terms, and therefore in European language too, corn referred to the grain that was indigenous to a particular land. And because maize was the corn of America, it got to be labeled with the name corn. Corn can be rendered into flour, it can be made into meal, it can be converted back into cereal, it can be reconstituted by soaking it in water and can be used almost as fresh corn again. So corn is one of those grains that needs to have an important place in our supply. Millet is a very neglected grain. We feed it to birds. It's one of the main components of bird feed in our country. And yet millet, when added to the flour that you're milling for your bread, can add some special nutritional characteristics and can also be much appreciated by people who are somewhat allergic to grains such as wheat. It doesn't have the aggravation of the components of wheat. So some people can find millet very important in their diet. These grains can become important to us only if we're able to reduce them to a form in which they can either be cooked or baked. This means that we must have some provision for converting the grains to flour. The simplest way to do it, and the way that Americans did it for many generations, was with a hand wheat grinder. These are still available, and they can render an important service for us because they're quick, they don't need electricity, and they can mill grain in a very heavy form, such as you might want for cracked bread. But if you want fine baking flour, then you must eventually have something like this, a fine flour mill. This is one form that's popularly available today, and this is a heavy-duty one that I've been using to make flour with now for nearly 30 years. With these electrical appliances, we're in a position to render flour of a very, very fine form, even those that you can do fine French pastry with. And so, along with our supplies, along with the foods, we might consider the importance of acquiring appliances that permit us to convert those flours, those grains that is, to the flours from which we can make everyday bread. Behind me are arrayed a wide range of flour products which we have all made out of our supplies of whole grains. Beginning over here is a fine Boston brown bread, which combines both whole wheat flour and freshly ground cornmeal, along with raisins, which similarly came out of our supplies. A loaf of good European pumpernickel bread, filled with the pungence of rye flour, along with the whole wheat flour, and with the added poignancy that you get from some molasses. A French sourdough bread, and along with the yeast that must be a part of your supplies, you might consider getting involved with some sourdough, which you can produce at home, which you can synthesize out of just flour and water or flour and milk at any time and nurture it over the years. This is made from a batch of sourdough, which for us is about 12 years old. Hard rolls made from whole grain products and covered with poppy seeds for a final touch. My wife's favorite is graham crackers. And one of the things that we wouldn't want to do without in an emergency is something as common as graham crackers, all made, lovingly made, I might add, from our own whole wheat. Dr. Graham was one who tried to reinstill in American people an appreciation for using whole wheat flour. But Americans were suspicious of the term whole wheat, so he called it graham flour. And thus the graham crackers that we have today are traditionally made from the very whole wheat flour that we're talking about here. You can branch out into things like hamburger rolls, which Americans have become so accustomed to, but these hamburger rolls are made out of whole wheat flour and are therefore more nutritious. We might go to our oven and pull out a homemade loaf of whole wheat bread and along with it some hot dinner rolls made from a blend of 2 or 3 different kinds of flour ground in our home mill. Or if you like some English muffins along with your breakfast, along with some of those homemade jams and jellies that are in your supply, then you can turn out very fine quality English muffins at home using both your whole grain flour and some freshly ground cornmeal. Or if you're serving some soup for dinner made from some of those legumes in your supply, then you might also like to add for your family's menu some breadsticks made with cheese and other flavorings that add so much to a meal of soup. just to show what can be done if you want to get fancy, another fine loaf of French sourdough bread made from whole grains, or an herb bread made into a braid. And so you'll get the idea that there's almost no end to the variety of things that you can do with whole grain flours at home. Now, wheat has an almost unlimited shelf life. We ought to think in terms of having about 300 pounds for each member of our family in our supplies. And if you want to vary that, then instead of 300 pounds of wheat, add 25 pounds of rye or 50 pounds of oats. And I might add that the oats, when roughly coarsely ground in the hand grinder, make a wonderful breakfast cereal. It takes a little bit longer to cook than do the rolled oats that many of us are accustomed to, but the nutrition is much greater. The grain that we call wheat is really one of nature's miracles. All of that goodness is encased within a hard skin that makes it almost impervious to weather changes, to temperature changes, to heat and light, and therefore it is unique among storage foods. For most other grains, and we'll take for consideration rice, has the germ located in the outside of the skin, and therefore whole rice or whole grain brown rice has a very limited shelf life because of the rancidity that will set in if it's subjected to very much heat for very long. Wheat, on the other hand, will withstand almost all of those things. And so I give you wheat as the very heart and soul of the grain part of our family preparedness program. In what must stand as one of the earliest food surveys ever recorded, because we find it in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, we see a comparison of two food groups. The king's people were accustomed to eating meats and receiving their protein from that source. But Daniel's people, those of whom he wrote, were accustomed to a diet which was simpler and more humble and closer to the soil. And so he asked the king to decide which was the better diet. And for 10 days, they compared the results of people who ate a food called pulses with those which were eating the more conventional king's diet. The pulses, we know, represented this entire food of legumes that we refer to today as the pea and bean family. The peas, the dry split peas that we store in our supplies today, and the lentil family represent a food that goes back to very ancient times, perhaps 5,000 years before the birth of Christ, in the valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates River. These foods were being grown and consumed by people. In fact, it was the principal source of protein for those people. Now today we're able to marry these foods with another member of that family, the beans. The beans are incidental to this land. They were found growing here by the Spanish conquistadores. In fact, in some of the caves in ancient Mexico, they have found beans that date back probably 2,000 or 3,000 years BC, indicating that that food, which is called Phaseolus vulgaris by agriculturists, has been around for a long time. For human beings to be able to utilize protein, it has to be consumed in the presence of 8 essential amino acids. Now, in the grain family, about which we've spoken with such enthusiasm, there are several amino acids that are not present in sufficient quantity for us to be able to make good use of the protein in grains. But that missing amino acid complement is found in this family of foods we call the legumes. Legumes, on the other hand, are missing in some of the sulfur-containing amino acids, which must also be present. But those missing amino acids in the family of legumes are present in grains. It's important for us in our supplies, therefore, to be able to understand the importance of protein complementarity. And as long as we consume together at one time members of these two families, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about that as we go on, we'll be able to give ourselves the protein, very high quality protein, in fact, that we need. And I want you to understand that there's tremendous variety that's available to the kitchen cook when it comes to these foods. We're not talking about basics that are boring. Just, for example, look at what we have available to us in this one family of legumes. We have green split peas that almost all Americans understand and have used in one form or another. They make a wonderful soup. They're superb. as a matter of fact, in soup because they don't require a lot of preparation time. You don't have to soak them overnight or for hours before you cook them. For variety's sake, yellow split peas, which are a very close cousin to the green split peas, offer a little difference in color, quite a bit of difference in flavor. Then there are whole peas. In this case, these are called Alaska peas. It's a variety, whole Alaska peas. These are not only great to be used in those soups if you want some whole peas in it, but they're wonderful as a sprouted seed. And when very lightly sprouted, they can be reconstituted almost to a form of fresh peas when they're cooked. And then the lentil family. Some of the pulses that are spoken of in the book of Daniel are in fact lentils. This is a very ancient food. It's been grown in the Mesopotamian valley almost since the beginning of recorded history. And they represent a very important source of protein. They're great in soups. They're wonderful in stews. They can be made into a meatless meatloaf. And for variety in the lentil family, besides the European lentils, we have an Oriental lentil, which is red in color and cooks to a different consistency and a little different color. And then the family of beans offers us such variety to actually stagger the imagination. There are over 1,000 variety of beans being raised in the world today. And each of them offers something a little bit distinctive, a little unique in what we can do with them. Beans like the Great Northern or white beans that most Americans have cooked with. To that can be added the red kidney bean, makes a wonderful refried bean, is excellent both cooked and baked and used in soups. One of the very ancient beans is the bean that we call the lima bean. And in its dried form, it can be used in soups. Again, it can be reconstituted by soaking overnight and cooked with ham hocks and baked. In fact, when I served in the military, I think one of my favorite rations was that which was known as ham hocks and beans. I couldn't get enough of them. Easterners, particularly people who live in New England, will know that the yellow eye bean is one of the greatest beans for baking. It possesses all those qualities that we need for a good baking bean. It absorbs the flavor of the things that are added to it, and yet it holds its shape during long periods of cooking. To this could be added any number of additional beans that are regional in flavor, from the Jacob's cattle beans, which are very popular once again in New England. The black turtle soup bean, neglected by much of America, but revered by people who have a South American background. Black turtle bean soup with a touch of grated onion on the top of it is one of the great rewards of legume cooking. People who live in the South will tell you that black-eyed peas are almost a necessity in life. Black-eyed peas, of course, are a member of the bean family. They're not really a pea. They cook up very quickly, and they create their own gravy. They have an ability to create a sauce, which makes them, just very delicious. And when combined with rice, in an old traditional dish called hoppin' john, they are just exquisite and offer a complete meal to those who partake of it. Again, from the ancient world is the garbanzo bean, very important to Mediterranean cooking. They lend themselves to being made into a paste with which a lot of other foods can be made, hors d'oeuvre type foods. And of course the soybean, linked with rice throughout Asia, is one of the world's most important foods. And the soybean is almost a story by itself because we can use it in so many different forms. It can be just simply cooked and eaten along with a rice dish for a complete protein, or it can be converted to tofu or miso or a number of Oriental foods which make it very, very compatible with human protein. And then there is the seed family, which we have to talk about at the same time because peanuts and other seeds act the same as do the legume family in complementing grains. One of the exciting things about this whole family of foods is how much quantity they cook up to. For instance, 6 cups of beans will result from just 1 cup that you have taken from dry stock. Similarly, the legume family in the peas will also produce a great deal of food for a very small amount of investment. And in the booklet that accompanies this video are a number of recipes that will help you to get started. We'll suggest some ways to use lentils in soups and how to bake up some of these beans. We'll give you some good basic recipes. Now, we told you that it was important to combine these foods, to be able to marry them with the grain family. And we're going to talk a little bit about that now. Now, there need be no great mystery about marrying together these food groups for maximum protein. In fact, every time we give one of our children a piece of whole grain bread spread with peanut butter, we're doing exactly that. And so you see, down through the years, we really have been doing some of the very same things we're talking about here. In this case, this is peanut butter, which has been freshly made in a kitchen blender from peanuts which have been stored raw in our supplies and then roasted very lightly in the oven to just that right grade of roastiness. They'll keep better in the raw stage. They will not keep very long once they've been roasted. Then they tend to go rancid. So again, a combination like a seed or a grain combined together, or the grain family and the legume family. Here's a pot of freshly baked New England beans, rich in all of the flavors that they get from molasses and other things that were also in our supplies. And we're going to serve them with some freshly steamed Boston brown bread. This bread combines whole wheat flour and corn flour together with raisins that also came from out of our supplies, and it's pungent again with the taste of a little bit of maple syrup, a little bit of molasses. A perfect combination, grains and legumes. For many, many years, in fact since ancient times, primitive races of people have innately known that they had to make these combinations. Beans and tortillas, combining corn with beans. Among the Italian people, you'll often see fagioli e pasta. That is a combination of pasta and beans. Again, marrying the grains with the legumes. And rice and soy among the Oriental people. All of these are natural combinations of grains and legumes, or nuts and seeds and legumes. We can also take care of the amino acid problem by adding a small amount, even a couple of tablespoons, of powdered dry milk to a whole wheat bread recipe. This will have the same effect of compensating for the missing amino acids. Now, as far as quantities are concerned, if I were working towards a one-year supply in these commodities, I would strive to arrive at about 25 pounds of beans for each member of my family, and a similar quantity, about 25 pounds, of the members of the pea family. And we could alternate our soups between a green pea soup, a yellow pea soup, a combination of the two. You might use ham hocks one time, you might just use some cut up vegetables another time. And again, we refer you to some of the recipes that we'll provide you with. In addition to adding another dimension to our food storage program, pasta production adds a lot of excitement and variety to the things that it's possible for us to create in our kitchens. Noodle making was something that our grandmothers and great-grandmothers did as an everyday event. They did it usually by rolling out flour and the dough which had been produced from combining it with eggs and water with a rolling pin, slicing it into the desired thickness after rolling it up with a sharp knife. Devices that we can still use today to make pasta at home. But for a very small investment, one can add to the kitchen itinerary a small device such as this pasta rolling machine, which does two things. By rolling the dough between a set of rollers whose thickness we can constantly vary, we reduce the dough to the exact thickness that we want and in a very uniform way. And then following that, we can cut it into various pasta sizes and shapes, from wide noodles for fettuccine to very fine noodles for a Chinese type of spaghetti. What we're going to do here now, just quickly to show you how easily this is done, is to turn this piece of pasta dough, which contains spinach, by the way, to add nutritional value. We'll turn it quickly into some fettuccine noodles. You can see how quickly that's done and how simple it is. Now, the best time to use these noodles in something is when they're fresh, like this, or after they have dried for just an hour or so. If you want to store them away for future use, then of course you can put them on your drying rack and dry them out even more. But cooked this way, they're very tender, far more tender than any noodles you'll buy commercially. And by varying the ingredients, you can either make them a vegetable dish by adding carrots or spinach, as in this case, or they can be turned into a dessert by adding citrus, some ground up pieces of orange peel and lemon peel for a dessert pasta. To begin with, you might just simply want to make a pasta made out of whole wheat flour, and that would produce a dough that looks something like this here, which has nothing more in it than whole ground flour, a couple of eggs, a little bit of water, touch of oil, and if you like, a little bit of salt. With that basic recipe, you can make a wide selection of pastas merely by varying the ingredients. One time you might want to make some corn pasta for a Mexican dish, and by using some of your whole corn that has been ground into flour. Another time you might want to make just regular whole wheat, or semolina, which is a favorite with the Italians. It's a very, very hard type of wheat. Well, one of my favorites is whole durum wheat flour. Whole durum wheat has a very high gluten content, a very high protein content, but yet it turns out noodle products that are nice and light gold in color, very attractive to look at. Then with the pasta you produced, you have the basis for some elegant soups and stews or main dishes with just a little bit of grated cheese or the flavoring of a tomato sauce from your shelf. You can very quickly put together a family meal, and one that's never the same twice in a row. Perhaps the ultimate dimension of family preparedness can be found in the shelves of a pantry lovingly stocked with food which has been preserved by the people who lived there. During World War II, Americans produced in their own victory gardens more than 1/2 of all the fruits and vegetables that our nation consumed during those trying times, as evidence of the possibility that is still ours to reach more deeply into the possibilities of self-reliance. As an example from our garden in a typical year, we will process both whole tomatoes, tomato juice, a thick sauce for Italian cooking, dried tomatoes, tomato chili sauce, which is a family recipe reaching back 2 generations for us, and even some marmalade, which is made from fresh tomatoes. We'll go on then to make sweet pickles and dill pickles, and the jams and relishes which take us through the days of a hard, cold winter, and which bring back memories of those summer days. In fact, nowhere does history revisit our kitchens in a more real way than in this thing we call home preservation of food. Let me give you an example. The tomatoes that are in this jar right here began their life more than a year ago in a little planter where I had inserted the seeds in a window box. I nurtured the plants all through a warm summer. We harvested the fruit, processed them ourselves. And not long ago, as I went to the pantry shelf and picked up these dried, dehydrated peaches for a winter snack, I was carried back to a day last autumn on a fall day in October when the rain was coming down, and I was picking in this orchard all by myself. And every one of these peach halves in here is a reminder to me of everything that went into putting them aside. We're not far from those days when our forefathers preserved virtually all the food that they ate. And many times they didn't have access to some of the modern methods and technologies that we have today. They resorted to drying when all else failed. An old-time method was to dry green beans, and they were called leather breeches. And these dried beans could be reconstituted in water or even in milk overnight and were turned into a family Sunday dinner. Today, with the help of the kind of ingenuity that we have at our command, we can use electricity at home to reduce food to a delicious dried form, as with these peaches. To do it with such ease that it only amazes me that we don't spend more time doing it. We can grow and pick some of our own herbs, like these dried sage leaves, and add to our supply of cooking herbs. Our dry foods can run the gamut from sweet cherries to Bartlett pears to the peaches we've already talked about, and a half a dozen other things in between. And if we're going to get involved in harvesting some of our own food, we ought to consider putting away with our supplies some seeds, some of those garden seeds that we cherish the most. Some of these seeds are in vacuum-packed tins to lengthen their shelf life. Even if we do no more than buy some of our seeds a year in advance, we'll almost always have a supply to go back to where we can produce our gardens and know that no matter what happens, we can grow some of our own. After all, there are people who grow gardens on the roofs of tenement buildings or in small containers in their backyard or on a patio. Almost wherever we live, we can find some way to grow some of our food and build for ourselves some of those valuable connections with our past. Family preparedness is, after all, a very personal challenge. There are no two people, no two families who would compose exactly the same list of those things that ought to be put aside for the future. In our little book that we've suggested some areas, you should not overlook medical needs, the specialized needs of people in the family, and of course sanitation supplies play a very important role. Personal things like the medications that we need, eye treatment materials if we are people who are wearing contact lenses, the sanitation supplies that we need for small children, maybe even some pet food ought to be among those things that we list. And we ought not to overlook such things as water. While we're limited in how much water we can set aside, there are always nooks and crannies in the home that we can fill with small containers of water, such as these recycled 2-liter soda pop bottles. They'll fit in where almost nothing else will. They're important in a freezer. They'll help to extend the cooling period during a power outage. And then there are those things that are crucial to the use of our basic foods, and they ought to be considered right along with the fundamentals that we've already talked about. Items such as dry powdered milk, so important to our baking. Each 3-pound container of powdered milk will reconstitute to about 19 or 20 quarts of milk. And if we can obtain it in the vacuum-packed tins, its shelf life becomes very long indeed. It's important, of course, to have shortenings in oils for baking and cooking. Solids have a longer shelf life than liquids do. And then when it comes to sweetening our foods, whatever your preference might be, sugar, from white sugar to dark sugar to confectioner sugar to molasses for those baked beans we talked about, and honey. Honey is a very long-keeping item, and especially if you make certain to always acquire honey which has never had water added to it and which has been not heated, will have a long shelf life because it will eventually cure into a semi-solid form. You might want to add such niceties as dried buttermilk for biscuits and pancakes. And of course baking powder, baking soda, cornstarch and thickening agents, some packaged raisins, and these will keep much better if we put them into a tightly lidded container after we bring them home. And of course yeast goes hand in hand with the whole grains. If we're going to have a comprehensive home baking plan, then we need to have the leavening with which we make the bread rise. Wheat and yeast seem to be made for each other in the American diet. It is the gluten in the hard winter wheat that allows the yeast to produce those bubbles of air that make the bread rise and be so beautiful. Instead of buying yeast in small packages, I would suggest that you hunt for a source of it in these 2-pound containers. A 2-pound package of yeast will make about 192 loaves of bread. That's quite a bit of baking. And it has a long shelf life if we repackage it in perhaps some pint mason jars and put it in the refrigerator or the freezer. It's also about 10 times cheaper to buy it in these quantities. So economy plays a role here. And it's important to have some fun foods. If your family is like mine, you've got kids and possibly grandkids who would be bored stiff if they couldn't have something to break up the monotony of a food supply that is very different from what they've been accustomed to. So when we store corn, store some popping corn. In fact, if you can only store one kind of corn, store popcorn. It will grind and mill into a fine flour. It'll make a good meal. And of course, it's always there to turn into those fun foods for an evening when you need to break up some of that boredom. I don't know of an American that doesn't like popped corn. And then we can extend the variety of our breakfast foods. And we can make our own granola at home simply by making certain that we have stored the supplies from which it's made. Some rolled oats and other rolled grains, some dried fruit, some nuts that can be broken up into it, some sweetening, maple sugar, syrup, honey. Those are the items that will compose a cereal that is about 1/4 the cost of what you buy in bulk form ready-made. And this opportunity even extends to those cereals that we might think of as being strictly commercial. Here we have some flakes. These are bran flakes. But out of your own basic supplies, you can make corn flakes, rice flakes, bran flakes, and all kinds of combinations simply by making a dough, a very thin dough that you can roll out with a rolling pin, dry in a warm oven, and break up, crinkle up into these pieces. And that makes a very perfect way to start the day out in a home that's living off of basic supplies. If yeast becomes a problem, if you get caught without yeast, you can produce your own at home. Sourdough is almost an American tradition. In fact, it's a worldwide tradition. For as far back as written records go, people have been doing their baking with homemade yeast mechanisms. And that's all that sourdough is a yeast that's been captured from out of the air around us by creating an environment of liquid and flour in which it can grow. And in our booklet, you will find some suggestions on starting your own sourdough at home. Along with these other fun foods, of course, it's nice to have some dried fruit on hand. I don't know of a winter snack that tastes better than dried fruit. And whether that be some dried crisp banana chips or some dried Bing cherries, which we picked off of a tree as a family ourselves and dried in the summertime, we can offer our family an array of varietal foods that add fun and interest, nutrition and taste to everything else that we're doing with our basic supplies. Turning our homes into resource centers means identifying those places that lend themselves to storage. Places perhaps in our basement that are cool, dry, dark, and then building in shelves and other storage devices that are, at least to the extent we can make them, earthquake-proof. Sometimes merely the addition of a furring strip to a shelf of preserves will keep them from jarring out when there's a tumbler around. And then finding and locating those items that are good for storing food. Plastic containers, metal, friction lid containers. And again, keep in mind mobility. One of these containers filled with grain or legumes will weigh about 25 to 30 pounds. That makes it easy to move if you have to. And if, like some of us, you've moved from one home to another over a period of years, you will learn to appreciate the advantage of mobility. In short, making our homes panic-proof, making them more secure, means turning them into resource centers and making use of the space that we have to make our family food supply secure. We live in a dangerous world. In fact, some have said there's no such thing as a safe place. We're surrounded by hazards that constitute dangers, even if we have made our homes secure. People who have lived through such disasters as the earthquakes in California, Hurricane Hugo, sometimes these hazards take the form of a local accident, the spill of hazardous chemicals. Things that make us have to evacuate our homes quickly with very little time to get ready. Now, we've all known what it's like to get prepared for 2 or 3 days in the great outdoors. We've loaded our packs, we've planned the things that make the difference between a comfortable vacation and a miserable one. Well, as we prepare for the kind of emergency that takes us out of our home, we need to be aware of the fact that it takes about 3 days for local agencies to gear up to be able to take care of people. The ones who are able to survive that period with a degree of grace are those who have planned ahead. We're going to talk now about preparing the 72-hour grab bag kit for every member of the family. The first consideration in a grab bag kit is mobility. The pack that we use should be designed and geared to the requirements of the individual. Some people need a small pack. Some people can obviously handle a little bit more weight. In this case, we have chosen a pack that has compartments in it, and as you'll notice, there's a sleeping bag attached to the bottom, a lightweight down sleeping bag, which doesn't take up very much room. After we've taken care of the mobility considerations, then we consider what goes into it. And again, this becomes a personal matter. Each person should probably make out their own list of things that they want to have with them. But the important things are those things that will keep us warm, those things that will help to keep us dry, those things that will keep us clean, and those things that will satisfy the hunger that's apt to come along in a 3-day period. And so you see arrayed before you here a number of items, including those that can give us the opportunity to be in communications with the world around us. Absolutely essential in at least one pack of one member of the family is a small handheld radio, and in this case I have even taped it to the local station, which carries the emergency broadcast network for the area in which we live. Along with the radio, a flashlight can make a great difference in the comfort that comes to you, the sense of security in knowing where you're at after dark. If you're going to have a radio and a flashlight, you should also have some backup batteries, sufficient to the needs of each of those. You'd be surprised how, in an emergency situation, you'll be listening to that radio more than you think you might, and using that flashlight rather considerably. Arrayed near it now are some waterproof matches, and just in case, a sealed lighter. You might not think of it, but a little lighter can make up to 1,000 lights. And regardless of the weather, whether it be raining or snowing or what, it's nice to know that you can have a small fire. A couple of candles for some emergency lighting, a small first aid kit contained within a metal box where they're weather tight. Some water is important. And the reason that I've chosen the 2-liter soda pop bottle once again is because it's so easily obtainable. You can easily string 2 of these across your neck using an old piece of rope or cord. I have a map of the 4-state local area, just in case I had to move around some during that period of time. For small children, you might want a couple of games, a card game, a word game. Here I have a small, soft covered book for reading, some writing material to while away the time, and then the food. The food is very much like you'd have on a trail program, where you're going to be outdoors for a short period of time. Some lightweight dried foods, some soup mixes, some scrambled egg mix, some flip-top cans containing some meat products, and some candy bars, and such other things as might suit your particular needs. A change of clothing, particularly 1 or 2 pair of clean socks, can make a big difference between surviving and surviving with a little bit of grace. Some heating utensils. In this case, I have a small portable campsite heater and a metal cup in which to brew up some of that dehydrated soup mix. And then some sanitary supplies, depending upon your own needs. At the very least, some portable tissues, some toothpaste and a toothbrush, some materials for cleaning up your hands if you don't have access to a lot of water. And some of these little steel towelettes can be perfect for that. Someone has said that pain is unavoidable, but misery is optional. It's important that all of the grab bag packs for the family be kept at one central location, in a place where every member of the family knows that they are at. It might also be a reasonable place to have a message center, a tin can or something in which, if anyone in the family has to leave early, they leave a message for those that come after them, so that they have an idea of how to communicate with those who have already gone. You might even want to consider extending this to include not only each member of your family, but to have an extra kit that stays in your car or each of your cars. You might also want to augment this with some winter material, so that in cold weather you have some additional warm weather gear that you might need to have with you. In short, being prepared for a short-term emergency isn't much different than getting ready for a comfortable camping trip. And it's certainly something that we all need to be thinking about, because this is indeed a dangerous world. In the final analysis, becoming more self-reliant is a very personal matter. For me, it's all tied up with my mother's chili sauce, my father's flock of Rhode Island red-laying hens, and boyhood memories of shelves overflowing with the good things our family had produced, in surroundings very much like these that we have been walking through. And the word family calls to mind the firmly held conviction that the most important piece of furniture in any home ought to be the dining room or kitchen table at which we eat, the place where we come together to savor not only food, but to share important ideas. It is here that the greatest successes in family life can be measured. It has been said that every animal in the forest teaches its young how to survive from one season to the next, how to deal with emergencies. Can we as parents do any less than this? Being more prepared consists of all of the things we've talked about here, the concepts and the skills and technologies necessary. In this and in succeeding messages, what we want to do is to help you become more adept at the art of being prepared.